Yeah, and I mean, it brings up the complicated task of engaging with one's text in conversation with those of another tradition. And the case of Christianity and Islam, but also Judaism, of course, for other accounts, not for Mary and Jesus. I often tell my students this, like, the similarities make things more complicated because you have competing claims over similar figures. I mean, maybe I can just add here a question about the history of Quranic studies. And, I've worked on Quran and Bible a bit, and there's a long history of Western scholars sort of explaining from their perspective Quranic material, like Surat Maryam, like the story of the palm tree and the dates, and the voice, or the tradition of Jesus speaking as a child, or not a child, a baby, really. But there's this long tradition of Western scholars explaining things in light of the biblical tradition. And yeah, I wonder what is your response to that? I mean, having studied tafsir, which has different opinions about whether you can even use the Bible to interpret the Quran. Yeah, so thoughts about that generally?
I mean, even one step back from that question is, what do we have in terms of the principles of interpretation, the rules or the procedures and the processes of interpretation? That is, it was that kind of core question I had to address in my doctoral work around tafsir of the Quran through the Quran.
Yes.
Right. So while the point is made, so where are the details? What is involved in doing that? And also, as some of our discussions will take us on to, what is the scope for not just new opinions in exegesis, but what about even new methods? Can methods be updated as time goes on? And would one of the motivating factors for these updates perhaps be, those who are external to your tradition contributing something? So can we, for example, can Muslim hermeneutes, Muslim exegetes learn anything from Western historical, critical, or literary readings of the Quran? I think that the usul al-tafsir, which is to say the principles governing exegesis, can and should be updated. First of all, by drawing from actually what has existed in tradition, but hasn't always been gathered and consolidated in one place. And that's what I was doing with the tafsir al-Quran bil Quran subject, is saying there's so much that has been said, but it hasn't been sort of systematized into one clear picture about how to study the Quran intratextually, right? When it comes to intertextual study, again, it does exist. So Muslim exegetes did think about, what is the background to these verses? What are the subtexts? Or, they'd have different ways of describing that, and they do it to different extents. The most famous example, of course, Al-Biqa'i, Ibrahim Al-Biqa'i has done a particularly, he has given particular focus to the Bible compared to most exegetes. But you'll still find parts of that with many exegetes. So the fact that it exists before is helpful to people who are wanting to update, because we can say, well, it's not like it's coming from nowhere. It's not like it hasn't, the Quran itself is telling you, and this is what I like to use the word tasdeeq studies, or the tasdeeq approach to study, because that's a Quranic word that describes, the relationship of the Quran to previous scriptures, right? It's musaddiq. And there's conforming, or that's really the issue, because maybe within that term there could be other understandings, that confirming, but also could be updating, correcting, redirecting. There's different ways of understanding what could the word tasdeeq contain and refer to.
Right.
But basically, I would say that there should be no reason why Muslim exegetes, so believers in the Quran, couldn't say, yeah, maybe there is a value in giving more attention to some areas of interpretation that haven't been given much appreciation before, such as the biblical pretexts or subtexts for certain stories. just as and this is like to back up my point and to shore off any criticism, the same thing has happened with other fields of inquiry in the history of Quranic exegesis. So it wasn't necessarily always the case that balagha or the Arabic rhetoric was considered central to interpreting the Quran, right? But at some point, that method won out and became fundamental to works of tafsir, right? Particularly with the time of Zamakhshari, the Mu'tazilite exegete. You know, he brought the balaghi or literary rhetorical study of the Quran to, you know, to its pinnacle at that time, and then everyone after that sort of has to follow in some of those footsteps, at least in appreciating the Quran is read literarily, right? And then in the 20th century, you have got some outgrowths from that, and you've got something called the adabi or the literary school of Quranic exegesis. So it's possible to have something which exists maybe in a nascent form or is not given that much attention, but then for one reason or another,
yes,
in the current times, some exegetes could say, you know what, I think this approach has got much more to give. I will give it more attention. So I'm looking forward to seeing more in terms of thinkers who are thinking from within the Muslim traditional framework, but giving more attention to what is being said around connections with biblical or parabiblical or all late antique materials, rather than just sort of leaving that to non-Muslim scholars basically and saying, well, or to see that as a threat or to see that as, you know, as an insult, or, you know, rather than that, Muslim scholars could look at that and say, well, that is a very interesting set of propositions, a set of data at least. How could we interpret that data in light of how we see the Quran? That's what I'm
right,
tentatively naming tasdeeq studies, and hoping to, you know, maybe encourage some kind of conferences and things to grow out of that.
tasdeeq studies, yeah, fascinating. I saw an interesting remark for a completely different study that I was doing on Jonah in the Quran, and I was reading Tafsir al-Manar, you know, principally written by Rashid Ridda, and the Lebanese Syrian scholar who worked in Cairo in the early 20th century. But he made a comment about, he sort of recounted different traditions which explain the material in Surah 37 and 21 and 10 about Jonah. And then he says, and this is basically no different than what we find among the people of the book. And the remark is sort of interesting because it actually is different. But
right.
It's interesting to see that he was sort of attentive to that question in the early 20th century. That was something that, because I don't think you always find that sort of observation or added comment. So,
and even you find, for example, his teacher, his mentor Muhammad Abdu, he says something about the words, the formula Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. He argues, I'll say it in a very simplistic way, but it's a bit more subtle than this, but he basically argues that it is a rejoinder to the doctrine of the Trinity. And that is the reason that it is formed in this way of these names, because it contains within it the essence of God and the permanent attributes of God and the relational attributes of God. And he says that's what the Trinity is supposed to represent, these three things. But that's contained in Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
Interesting.
So that's an example actually of a kind of tasdeeq approach, which is to say, you know, believing that the Quran is not like this accidentally or purely due to historical reasons, but as revelation, as Muslims hold, it is doing this active engagement with the early scriptures. Yeah, so it has certainly a long enough pedigree.